So our last speaker for today is William Hasselberger, who is a philosopher and professor of politics at the Catholic University of Portugal in Lisbon. He also has a long connection with UVA, having received his PhD in philosophy here and continued on as a postdoctoral fellow and now a visiting fellow with the Institute. His research focuses on virtue ethics, specifically the relation of virtue to tacit practical knowledge and how reductive accounts of personhood distorts our understandings of ethics. His paper today is The Psychology of Happiness and the Phenomenology of Value. His respondent will be my colleague from the Catholic University of America, Jonathan Buttaci. There, he is assistant professor in the School of Philosophy. His research concerns theories of knowledge, learning, and the soul in ancient Greek philosophy with a focus on Plato and Aristotle, with his current work focusing on Aristotle's model of mind. He seeks to connect these classical arguments with more recent debates in 20th and 21st centuries on similar topics in philosophy of mind and philosophy of science.
Very good. Well, it's always good to be back here and nice to see a number of you. And I've very much enjoyed the talk so far, and this connects with, I think, some of the stuff this morning as well. So it's a nice setup. So the last 20 years or so have witnessed an explosion of social scientific research on human happiness or well-being, including happiness economics, affective neuroscience, and most prominently, positive psychology. The imperative to scientifically study, measure, quantify, and offer proposals to maximize the happiness of individuals and groups is now everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. Interdisciplinary research centers devoted to the science of happiness have mushroomed. University classes on the topic now attract large numbers of students. Tal Ben-Shahar's popular course at Harvard is an example of this. There are now social science journals called the Journal of Happiness Studies and the Journal of Positive Psychology. There's an Oxford handbook of the psychology of happiness that comes in at over 1,000 pages. But the most prominent researchers and institutions working on the science of happiness have aims in addition to mere empirical description and scientific explanation. They hope to make us happier. The use of the latest social science and biology to try to define and measure and enhance happiness now extends well beyond the academy into the fields of medicine, business management, government, public policy, and even into the work of international and non-governmental organizations. We are awash, I think it's fair to say, in different metrics and indices of happiness that purport to provide objective, scientifically grounded criteria to assess individual well-being and the average levels of happiness of different demographic groups, professions, or even whole countries. Both the United Nations World Happiness Report and the Organization for Economic Growth and Economic Cooperation and Development Better Life Index move beyond reporting on the material and economic conditions of their member states and provide quantitative rankings based on the latest social science of different countries' average levels of happiness, couched in terms of subjective reports of life satisfaction. I'll just say Portugal, where I live, ranks a mere 66 out of 156 countries on the 2019 World Happiness Report, with a population that is found to be less happy than that of Kazakhstan and Kuwait, and roughly on par with Pakistan. I like to tell this to my students, and as call to mind the Portuguese family on the beach drinking their coffee, complaining about how hard life is. So the economist Lord Richard Layard, whom The Guardian calls the UK's happiness czar, has launched a political action group in Britain called Action for Happiness, arguing that recent work by positive psychologists like Ed Diener finally enables national governments to accurately measure human happiness, and that governments should use findings in the sciences to enhance the happiness of their citizens, including providing lessons on happiness in public schools and judging schools in part based on the progress in enhancing the happiness of their students. The positive psychologist Martin Seligmann, who's been pivotal in moving psychology beyond the study and treatment of illness towards the promotion of happiness, advocates a new, quote, politics of well-being, end quote, which will employ the latest science to enhance our levels of happiness within various institutions. And people with real influence, including governments, are paying attention. So this is not just an academic phenomenon. Seligmann helped to design a wellness test for the US military to the tune of $125 million called the Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Test, which aims to measure the, quote, psychological strength of soldiers, including their emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. I'll come back to that. The British government under David Cameron followed suggestions from happiness scientists and ordered the Office of National Statistics to begin collecting national data on levels of happiness, qua subjective well-being, as an official government statistic, along with GDP, and has created the Behavioral Insights Team, popularly called the Nudge Unit, which, with help from psychologists and social scientists, which studies national well-being and proposes policies that may nudge us towards better decisions and happier lives. This has included seemingly relatively benign things like the training of thousands of therapists in cognitive behavioral therapy, and less benign things like certain qualifications for receiving government welfare for certain parts of the population premised on whether or not they attend cognitive behavioral therapy. This is unemployed people who are judged to, have a problem and must take cognitive behavioral therapy before they receive their welfare checks. In 2019, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand announced at the Global Gathering of Economic and Political Elites at Davos that her government would formulate a, quote, well-being budget, world's first well-being budget, she put it, using national statistics of well-being designed solely around, quote, well-being priorities, with a special focus on the unhappiness suffered by the worst off in society. The European Commission has set up a project called GDP and Beyond, which aims to objectively measure and analyze data about well-being in all 26 EU member states. Beyond governments, several large corporations and firms have recently created the position of Chief Happiness Officer, a new role within the management structure, different from HR, with the responsibility of monitoring and managing employees' levels of happiness and satisfaction at work and using cutting-edge findings on happiness and its measurement. I could go on for like a long time about this. It's really hard to overstate how much stuff is out there in this direction. So in this paper, I'm going to analyze in philosophical terms the most popular and influential conception of happiness underlying, at work in this imperative to measure and analyze and tweak and enhance happiness. The conception of gradable subjective well-being from positive psychology. I will draw upon philosophical ethics, phenomenology, and a bit of the philosophy of action to argue that this reigning conception of human happiness is seriously flawed. It falls prey to a certain conceptual instability between two different viewpoints or outlooks on the nature of human conscious experience and action. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So I also am going to argue that it fails to provide reliable normative guidance and may actually occlude some of the true sources of contemporary dissatisfaction and unhappiness. And then at the very end, I'm going to shift to a more sociological and political register and ask, what explains the very strong attraction to the idea and prestige behind the idea that happiness, assumed to be a final end of human desire and action, can be analyzed in abstraction across a large and diverse population, operationalized, measured, and promoted by scientific experts in the first place. By the end of the paper, I hope to have shown where we may find a more plausible and promising avenue for understanding well-being. So I do want to sort of gesture in the direction of a positive alternative to what I take to be a problematic reigning orthodoxy. So, quote one on the handout. In a special edition of the journal Daedalus entitled On Happiness, the psychologists Ed Diener and others write, quote, "A combination of radical new thinking and sophisticated methodology has allowed psychologists to add substantially to our understanding of this concept that has historically been the domain of philosophers and theologians. For the first time, we are able to measure happiness." Okay, so this is a striking claim, or at least it should strike us if we weren't already kind of inundated with claims about the science and expert measurement of happiness, in which case we may just sort of fails to register. But we should ask, wait a minute, how exactly is it that scientists are, for the first time in human history, able to measure happiness and definitively dispel the mystery surrounding this most elusive and puzzling feature of human existence? What conception of happiness is at work, and with what radical new thinking? Now, despite claims that by many happiness researchers that theirs constitutes a radically new vision and policy program, the idea that happiness is a subjective state that can and should be given an operational definition, quantified, graded, and promoted by scientific experts for the betterment of society, is not new, right? It's found in the work of 18th and 19th century Enlightenment thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, Francis Edgeworth, Comte, certain French philosophers, and has conceptual roots still further back. Certain elements of it have roots further back in British thinkers like Hume and Hutchinson and even Hobbes. So Bentham, just to take an example, gives what's effectively an operational definition of happiness, understood as an subjective psychological condition of an individual consisting in the presence of pleasurable sensation and the absence of painful sensation. Pleasure or pain can in turn be quantitatively measured in terms of 7 formal components, most centrally being the felt intensity of the pleasure or pain and its duration. This conception of happiness forms the foundation of Bentham's famous philosophic calculus and the utilitarian imperative to maximize net social happiness through public policy, including Bentham's proposed reforms to British political, judicial, and penal institutions. In the late 19th century, the economist Francis Edgeworth attempted to provide a more precise quantitative calculus of happiness than even Bentham had achieved, and imagined a psychophysical machine for precisely measuring the, quote, pleasure units over time, what he called a hedonometer. Let me just read this one quote from Edgeworth that I love this quote. It's not on your handout. I should have put it on the handout. "Let there be granted to the science of pleasure what is granted to the science of energy. To imagine an ideally perfect instrument, a psychophysical machine, continuously registering the height of pleasure experienced by an individual exactly according to the verdict of consciousness, or rather diverging therefrom according to a law of errors. From moment to moment, the hedonometer varies, the delicate index now flickering with a flutter of passions, now steadied by intellectual activity, now sunk low whole hours in the neighborhood of 0, or momentarily springing up towards infinity." Right? So the contemporary metrics and programs to define and measure and enhance happiness are, I think, much more sophisticated. They have much more better mathematics. They have better brain science and so forth. But I think they're firmly rooted in this project. And some people, as like Richard Layard and Daniel Kahneman, are clear about that. Others proclaim that this is some sort of radically new thing. Now, what is the view of happiness that they're using here that would make sense at all of this kind of project? The default view among contemporary social scientists is that happiness can be understood as subjective well-being, a kind of construct. A subjective psychological condition occurring inside individual human beings or their brains, and consisting in positive affects, roughly 2 kinds of things. Positive affect on the one hand, and positive judgments about their lives on the other, or some combination of those. So let me just break this whole movement down into what I think are 5 shared elements of these views. Even, I mean, look, Layard, Kahneman, Diener, Mihaly, Csikszentmihalyi, these guys have different views, but I think you can identify 5 things that are basically in common that they all more or less accept. One is that happiness or well-being is an ultimate or intrinsic end of human activity, something that we value for its own sake, and maybe it's the ultimate end or purpose of human striving. Secondly, happiness for the purposes of scientific research and public policy can be analyzed as this thing, subjective well-being, right? A felt psychological condition within the individual that consists either in positive affects, and that's things like feelings of pleasure, feelings of engagement, absorption, positive emotion like joy, pride, gratitude, and then on the other hand, positive judgments, cognitive or reflective judgments about their satisfaction with the conditions of their lives, more broadly speaking. So that's subjective well-being. Now, of course, subjective well-being, being subjective on this view, cannot be directly observed from the outside, so that we need the hedonometer, right? On this view, it can be reliably graded in terms of quantifiable objective indicators of some kind, including verbal responses to questions, physiological changes, behavior, and brain activity. That's claim 3. Claim 4 is given thorough empirical monitoring and measurement, researchers can then determine the most common and effective causes to or detriments to, causes of or detriments to subjective well-being. And then lastly, happiness science can be used to offer tests and policy proposals for the assessment and enhancement of happiness within various institutions and areas of human life. I think they all basically share this. In the paper, I go through some more of the go a little bit into the weeds about the differences between, say, Layard, who's more of a hedonist, Kahneman, kind of a hedonist, versus Ed Diener, who combines the positive affect. His account of subjective well-being includes both positive affect and this component of judgment about satisfaction with your life. Csikszentmihalyi adds this notion of flow and engagement with one's activities. And then Martin Seligmann, who offers the most complex view, describes authentic happiness or flourishing as consisting in this wide range of positive emotions, including basically everything these other guys say, but in addition to that, a sense of accomplishment for its own sake, not for any end that gets you, just doing something, and a sense of meaningfulness, which he defines as the condition in which an individual feels like a part of something bigger than him or herself. Okay, so how do we, there's various ways to try and measure this stuff, various indicators that people pick. Ed Diener has the satisfaction with life scale, where you ask things like, you give someone a set of statements like, I am satisfied with my life, and then you give them options like strongly agree, agree, slightly agree, neither agree or disagree, slightly disagree, or strongly disagree. This is kind of the thing that most of the non-governmental organizations use, is this satisfaction with life scale. Csikszentmihalyi, on the other hand, and Kahneman like this other model called the experience sampling method, where what you do is you stop someone in the middle of doing something in the day. Say they wear a pager or a device that buzzes at random intervals, and then you ask them to fill out, you ask them some questions that have to do with, that prompt them to, quote, rate her state of consciousness on various numerical scales, including concentration, motivation, and subjective happiness, end quote. So as opposed to the Diener thing, which is more of this reflective judgment, how satisfied are you with your life, this is supposed to capture the moment by moment felt character of your experience, right then. And it does that in particular because Kahneman thinks that our memories are very dodgy and our reflective judgments tend not to line up very well with our experienced utility, as he puts it. Okay, other methods of measurement are more straightforwardly physiological and neurological. Some researchers use functional brain imaging techniques to attempt to identify a, quote, pleasure center in the brain. That's the title of a relatively new book, that can be seen as the seat of happiness, with many particularly interested in the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala, or places in the brain that are rich in serotonin receptors. The famous example of this is the psychologist Richard Davidson at the Laboratory of Affective Neuroscience at University of Madison in Wisconsin, who's conducted all these studies on Buddhist monks trained in meditative practices who are found to have unusually high levels of activity in the left prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that is associated with positive affect. So there's this guy, Matthieu Ricard, one of the monks studied by Davidson, who's been found to display particularly high levels of prefrontal cortex activation. And this has led him to be dubbed by various newspapers and organizations as the happiest man on earth. Now, he was a guest of honor at Davos in 2017 and gave a special talk, and come back to why maybe the sort of business and political elites are interested in this Tibetan Buddhist monk. So happiness here is understood to be a matter of positive sensations and affects produced by certain brain mechanisms and involving neurotransmitters like dopamine and biochemical substances like serotonin. And taken strictly, this picture implies that everything other than subjective states and associated brain mechanisms, other stuff like love, art, sport, creative activity, contemplation, family, etc., can only have the status of a contingent causal trigger of the thing one really responds to and enjoys. The surging hormones and biochemical changes that constitute what are sometimes described as reward mechanisms within the evolved biology of Homo sapiens. So, from this vantage point, the measurement of happiness, assumed to be subjective and experiential, can be replaced by the measurement of wholly objective phenomena like changes in brain activity and so forth. And here I think we really see the contemporary incarnation of Edgeworth's dream of a psychophysical pedometer, which an expert can use to accurately read the quality of another person's inner life from the outside, even without talking to them or engaging with them. Just sort of read it. Right? Yeah, so there's more details that I go to about this, but let me just move ahead a little bit. So critics of positive psychology and happiness science have noted the first sort of criticism that people jump to is typically problems of linguistic and cultural variation in understanding the concepts of happiness, right? What are we talking about here when we're measuring this thing, happiness? An infamous problem is that the research base of most positive psychology experiments, namely undergraduate university students, tends to be white, educated, and from industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. They have an acronym for this, WEIRD. And hence they're unrepresentative of humanity at large, which tends not to be weird. And doubts have been raised about the validity and replicability of findings purporting to show the practical benefits of positive psychology interventions in people's lives. But I think the philosophical problems run much deeper than that. A classic objection to Benthamite hedonism is that he misunderstands the nature of the mental states in question, or treats them as overly simplistic, as sort of self-contained things. So, pleasure is not a singular, primitive felt sensation that is common to all pleasurable experiences and gradable on a single monistic scale, right? So there's no identifiable feel-good sensation present at both, say, eating a nice hamburger like I did last night and holding your child in your arms for the first time like I did 3 years ago. There's no common sensation there, differing only in intensity. Right, so there would be no number of hamburgers that would get me the child feeling. Martha Nussbaum argues further that the attempt to categorize human emotions as positive and negative with these two classes, with the goal of enhancing the positive ones and minimizing the negative ones, is conceptually confused about the nature of emotion itself and may have quite disastrous results. Now, emotions involve feelings, of course, right? They can feel bad or feel good, but they're not mere feelings with no intentionality or cognitive content. Many emotions are essentially felt evaluations of objects and situations. So fear is not merely an unpleasant bodily sensation with prickles and hair standing up on the back of your neck. It is also a felt apprehension of some feature or features of your circumstance as potentially threatening or dangerous to self. So-called negative emotions like fear, shame, guilt, anxiety, dissatisfaction, though they can misfire, can also be appropriate felt evaluations of particular objects and situations, namely those situations with features that merit that affective response. And they can then motivate the agent to act appropriately within those situations. So an honest and realistic view of a bad situation you're thrown into can involve an appropriate degree of displeasure or even anger. As such, negative emotions are extremely positive, that is valuable, positive in the sense of valuable, not feeling good, but that is partly constitutive of our most immediate awareness of the practical significance of features of the experienced world. Negative emotions are also part and parcel of some of the most meaningful human relationships and attachments. Speaking first personally here, parenting, right? Friendship, romantic love, all essentially involve the possibility of loss of the beloved, and thus possibilities of loss or pain to the beloved, so possibilities of anxiety and grief. And several important thinkers, from Kierkegaard to Heidegger and Jaspers, hold that negative experiences of guilt and anxiety and the awareness of, the fearful awareness of one's own mortality can be profoundly educative, revealing important existential truths about your own being as an individual that are inaccessible otherwise in sort of bloodlessly cognitive or intellectual terms. And so these negative emotions can enable a profound transformation of the self, such that one may live in a more lucid or authentic manner. Positive psychology, on the other hand, seems prematurely focused on expertly managing rather than properly understanding the nature of human suffering and negative emotion and their potential role in a well-lived life overall. Even positive psychology's admirable goal of diminishing purely pointless and neurotic suffering requires some background understanding of when suffering can be meaningful or have an appropriate role in life. And this, I think, cannot be read off whether the emotion feels negative or positive in the abstract. Now, look, positive emotions like contentment, joy, pride, and gratitude can also be negative in the sense that they can be inappropriate felt evaluations of particular situations and even diluted or harmful. Again, it all depends on the concrete circumstances of the individual life in question, not the felt qualities of the emotions in the abstract. A person contented with a bad situation because she's blind to its true character, or because she lacks desire for anything better, or has no deep attachments, or nothing to lose, right? That's not a particularly positive emotion in the sense of contributing to the goodness of her life or her well-being. The cheery contentment of a parent whose child has just died in an accident is no sign of a desirable condition of happiness. So the objection in sum is this. Human practical thought and agency involve affectively charged emotional responses to particular events and circumstances. Positive psychology attempts to isolate the purely psychological elements common to widely different experiences of well-being and to treat them as having a kind of self-standing normative valence or goodness in their own, or badness in their own right on the basis of their felt qualities. But this is, I say, reductive and implausible. Diminishing negative emotions and maximizing positive ones independently of a wider and richer conception of their cognitive dimensions and their situational appropriateness and place within the trajectory and course of a well-lived human life as a whole may turn us into cheerier and less anxious creatures, but may also diminish crucial human sensitivities, leaving us shallower, less capable of profound loves and attachments, and more prone to self-serving blindness and pleasing delusions. So to provide suitable normative guidance, positive psychology needs a much more nuanced grasp of the relevant emotions and their role in our cognition and agency. So, I think happiness on the dominant picture of positive subjective well-being assumed by positive psychology is assumed to be conceivable as an internal, felt, subjective mental state that is conceivable in principle independently of any richer context of cultural meanings, practices, and moral and social and political relations beyond the individual's skull. Bentham, I think, set the course for this when he wrote, quote, "Strictly speaking, nothing can be said to be good or bad, but either in itself, which is the case only with pain or pleasure, or on account of its effects, which is the case only with things that are the cause of pain and pleasure. From a scientific perspective, purged of superstition and empty metaphysics, thought Bentham, we can see that certain subjective states of consciousness are the only things that can matter for us. And anything else can only matter as being an actual or possible cause of those subjective states of consciousness." So I call this psychological subjectivism. This is the idea that the origin of all ultimate value in human life is confined within the domain of psychological states conceived independently of their particular objects, independently of what the person is pleased or joyful or about, right? It's just the state itself that's the bearer of value. I think this is shared by the variety of thinkers that I mentioned, whether they talk about pleasure, positive emotion, experience utility, satisfaction, flow. They're all basically working within that framework. Now notice, this fundamental orientation is not itself scientifically proven by positive psychology or any other happiness science. It's assumed as a presupposition for the whole methodology of the movement. The collection of data, the techniques of measurement and analysis, and normative prescriptions for improving happiness rest on this foundation. It's often claimed by researchers that this way, in talking about subjective well-being in this way, is a way of respecting people's own views of what matters to them. It is thus liberal in a broad sense. And it requires no teleological or theological or cosmological metaphysics, no summum bonum, as Hobbes said didn't exist anyway. So it is thus materialist, or at least consistent with materialism. Within this tradition, I want to point out that this is presented as kind of neutral, but in fact, if within this tradition, there's a really strong claim here about the nature of our mental life and our agency. The task of our evaluative psychology on this view, that is, our states of desire, pleasure, absorption, flow, satisfaction, etc., is never to reveal or uncover anything in particular about the world. For the positive psychologist, it's the psychological state located in the isolated psyche or brain of the individual that is the measurable self-standing good at issue. So even when positive psychologists stress, as they often do more concretely, that friendships are important for happiness, they mean that in a particular way, right? Friendships are a causally effective, commonly observed route to high levels of the positive internal states. Friendship is not itself seen as constitutive of what is good for human beings in some more fundamental sense. So I think this is clear with Csikszentmihalyi, the flow guy. I'll move through this a little bit quickly, but basically what he says is that he studies flow, which he claims, it's what athletes in the zone feel, or religious mystics in ecstasy feel, or artists and musicians, and it's all strikingly similar. He in fact says, this is quote 3, I'll just read the last sentence in the quote. He says, "But because almost any activity can produce flow," quote 2, But because almost any activity can produce flow, provided the relevant elements are present, it's possible to improve the quality of life by making sure that clear goals, immediate feedback, skills balanced to action opportunities, and the remaining conditions of flow are as much as possible a constant part of everyday life. So here what's going on is it's the flow that's what people really are after, and almost anything can get that to you as long as you tweak the sort of environmental conditions to produce the flow. So that's what mystics are really after and what athletes are after and so forth. Okay, and so here it's interesting that Csikszentmihalyi doesn't just talk about rock climbers and artists and nuns and surfers. He talks about people finding flow on assembly lines, playing pointless games, and even drumming their fingers. My favorite example is the guy who finds flow drumming his fingers in a mathematical pattern when he's at academic talks that he finds boring. Sort of achieves high levels of flow doing that. Now, Csikszentmihalyi says that flow makes for, quote, excellence in living. But if flow can be got at high doses in these ways, is it really fit to provide the role, to play the role of an ultimate end in life and to make for excellence in living? And I think similar questions can be asked of any of the positive affects and emotions identified by positive psychology, once we recognize that if you conceive them as abstract states of the isolated psyche with no necessary cognitive element, the individual could, in principle, feel them for almost any reason. Right? Now, the philosopher David Wiggins, who's a very challenging but very profound philosopher, I think, argues that theories of value and meaningfulness in life that locate all intrinsic goodness in what he calls non-cognitive or appetitive states, and he identifies Bentham as a culprit of this, are, quote, troubled by a curious instability. Okay, and what's this instability? It's because from the outer view, the view out, maximally depersonalized scientific view outside of human experience, nothing shows up as inherently or intrinsically valuable or good or meaningful, right? Including psychological states, hormonal discharges, brain firings. These look like mechanical pushes and pulls in some impersonal medium. So, says Wiggins, Bentham in his heirs must be talking about the inner view, right? Well, look at quote 3. But as experienced, that I would say from the inside of our phenomenology, the inner view too will reject this view of value, namely the view that all value comes from our own feelings. For adopting the inner view and supposing with Bentham that certain conscious states are good in themselves, we must take these states as they appear to the inner view. But then one cannot say without radical misconception that these states are all that is intrinsically valuable. For from the inside of lived experience and by the scale of value that they impose, the shape of an archway or the sound of the lapping of the sea against the shore at some place, at some time, may appear to be of an altogether different order of importance than the satisfaction that some human being once had from his breakfast. So, again, from the inner view, it doesn't look like, just my state of satisfaction is all that matters. That's not the way it shows up in the lived experience. So which view is the positive psychologist talking about? The outer view of hard science or the inner view of human? It's kind of, Wiggins claims this is essentially a reflective instability in this kind of picture of value. It's not really coherent at the end of the day. Positive psychology claims to study, quote, what matters most to people, end quote, but invariably ends up trying to force what matters to us into this psychological subjectivist frame that does not respect our evaluative experience on the inside. Let me just read a couple quotes from this. What I then do in the paper, I'm going to sort of move a little quickly here. What I then do in the paper is take a look at the inner view, really. Like, let's pay attention to the phenomenology carefully and not just say everybody wants flow. Let's actually look at a careful, thorough, first-hand description of some moment of enjoyment or flourishing. So take a look at quote 4. This is a first-person account of the intense experience of joy and fulfillment in swimming in freezing cold lakes and waters in Wales by someone named Roger Deacon, who is a swimmer who swam all over the UK and wrote hundreds of pages about the joys of swimming. So he writes, I went to Wales because the place is still with magic, because the Rheinog Mountains are something like a wilderness where I could be free to wander like pipe smoke in a billiard room, and with the kind of apparently random purpose with which the laughing water dashes through the heather, rocks, and peat. I went there to be a long way from all the powerful stimuli Wordsworth said prevented us these days from doing any proper thinking. It's interesting, he's connecting the swimming with thinking. My only purpose was to get thoroughly lost, to disappear into the hills and tarns and miss my way home for as long as possible. If I could find a string of swims and dips, each one surpassing the last in aimlessness, so much the better. The great thing about an aimless swim is that everything about it is concentrated in the here and now. None of its essence or intensity can escape into the past or future. The swimmer is content to be born on his way, full of mysteries, doubts, and uncertainties. He's a leaf on the stream, free at last from his petty little purposes in life. So this shares something with Csikszentmihalyi's account of flow and absorption and flashes of intense living. But what becomes clear from the Deacon is that these flashes of intense living are appreciated for their very specific objects in their concrete particularity, including an exceptionally vivid sense of embodiment and place. You know, these lakes, these waters, this place. I mean, it's not some abstract state in his head. So let me read one more. This is my favorite. I set off in a glowing dawn and drove on empty roads to the Norfolk coast, where I had arranged to meet Dudley, an old swimming and sailing companion. I could think of no better prospect than to enhance the day with bathing, walking, and conversation on one of the best beaches I know. The sudden lightness of being there, with such endless miles of level space, feels like a holiday, even for a few hours. Time passes slowly when you're a dot on the horizon. There is no antidepressant quite like sea swimming, and Holkham is where I usually go when I'm feeling sad. Dudley and I set off barefoot over the sandy boardwalk through the wooded dunes and emerged blinking from the shade into the gleaming theater of Holkham Bay. We made for the surf across the almost deserted beach and half waded, half walked into the sun. One of the great joys of Holkham Beach is to swim in the lagoons that appear in the sands as the tide goes out. Most are just deep enough for a wallow. Some are up to 4 feet in places. They can be very warm, and I once stepped on a Dover sole in one. Miles from anywhere, we came upon a watering hole that was especially long and deep, and splashed about it like two desert travelers in an oasis. So I quoted all this Deacon because these descriptions resonate with us, or at least they resonate with me. I know I can sort of be there. I'm like there on the beach in the sun and sand. And Deacon is surely feeling good, experiencing utility, absorbed, savoring moments of intense living, etc., etc. The kinds of psychological subjective phenomena that positive psychologists take to be so essential to human happiness. However, his positive affective experience, it has this, I think, very strong cognitive side, which is he's attending to, he's immersed as an agent within an experienced field of a life world made up of these beaches and these waves and these dunes. And the intentional content of his experience is essentially active, embodied, and world-involving. It's these waters, this beach, and even shared with his friends. So I think the nature and significance of his enjoyment, as he experiences it, cannot be separated from all that context. The sort of worldly arena of bodily agency and interaction of those particular beaches. That's what it's like, as philosophers put it, to have that passionate experience in question. From the inside, it makes no sense to say that Deacon could enjoy that fulfillment or well-being by becoming pleased or absorbed or satisfied with some entirely different object or situation, so long as his measurable happiness indicators were the same. That's the first thing to take from this description. Second thing to take from this description is this. We resonate with his description, I resonate with his description, as it makes sense to me as an example of human fulfillment or happiness, but not because we just note the presence of some merely formal or value-neutral psychological property, feeling good or prefrontal cortex activation or something like that. Our response to Deacon's description is premised on an extremely complex and mostly tacit background of human understanding, an underlying shared grasp of what it's like to be alive and human, and to feel the sun and the water, feel one's body awake and responsive and moving, to share an afternoon with a friend, explore a beautiful place, feel at home, and forget everything for a moment. And this sort of tacit stuff, which is in the background, I think, when we read a text and make sense of it, when we read that stuff, constitutes a framework of intelligibility within which we encounter and make sense of potential instances of human agency and enjoyment. Deacon's passionate attitude is intelligible to us, I think. The same could not be said, I say, if what he was doing was blissfully flowing and repeatedly picking up and dropping a coin over and over. This suggests that a formally identifiable psychological condition cannot count as some kind of self-standing intrinsic good for us humans. Okay, so I make a distinction that's a kind of wishy-washy, vague distinction, but an important distinction in the paper between the way that two different kinds of goods can show up in our experience, what I call deep goods and shallow goods. So imagine an artist who, call him A, who frustrated one day simply stops trying to discriminate firsthand what he finds beautiful or evocative or important, and stops trying to clarify and express his ideas in his work, and instead turns to contemporary psychology and affective neuroscience for direct guidance. He focuses on the latest psychological and neurological findings about how people and their brains respond, on average, to certain stimuli, and uses these data in a purely technical and procedural manner to attempt to produce certain subjective psychological responses in his audience. We can imagine him using real-time experience sampling methods a la Kahneman or Csikszentmihalyi on his observers. If certain shapes and color combinations tend to get higher numerical scores on Kahneman's hedonometer units, Kahneman uses that term in a homage to Edgeworth. If they get high scores, then he adds those shapes and color combinations. If not, he doesn't. You can even imagine him using neurobiological metrics. Right? But before he does anything, he seeks guidance from these scientific authorities. He proceeds methodically and churns out work. Now, forget whether this counts as art or not. I mean, that's a vexed question in philosophy. Think about what's missing, what's gone missing in this case. What's wrong about this case? What's missing there that's present in the case of a true artist, we would want to say. A is acting in a calculative and psychological managerial way that is entirely detached from the living, passionate, evaluatively charged experience that is characteristic of an agent who loves to make or enjoy art. He lacks a first-hand, non-theoretical appreciation of what I call the deep human good internal to passionate creative activity and aesthetic enjoyment. So deep goods are elements, this is my hand-wavy definition here, they're elements of our lived experience that show up first as having an intrinsic or non-instrumental value, they're good for themselves, and moreover, they have a kind of value whose content or nature is difficult or impossible to express exhaustively without remainder in propositions, discursive statements, or theories. Deep goods on the inside are experienced as calling to us or drawing us, and they resist definitive expression in our attempts to explain what's drawing us, especially to people who have firsthand experience of the thing in question. Shallow goods are any desired objects or activities that are not deep in that sense. So either because they're instrumental or because we can fully explain them without remainder. So intuitively, romantic love is a deep good, whereas having a working toilet is a shallow but important good. Encountering something so beautiful that it leaves you speechless, or gazing upon the face of your sleeping child, or musing contemplatively about the shortness of life and the vastness of the universe, these are deep goods. Having a decent tax accountant, shallow but important good. Now, an agent's experience and understanding of a deep good can grow more vivid and discerning over time and thereby transform the agent herself and redirect her desires and affects. Let me just skip ahead a little bit. So positive psychology feels, I think it knows that it should discuss the deeper elements of human fulfillment and well-being and satisfaction, but it has real difficulty in accommodating them in any way that is not, that doesn't end up looking kind of comical. For instance, look at quote 6. The UK government's ONS well-being test is a life satisfaction test involves a 10-point scale. You answer these 4 questions and you give a numerical score, 0 to 10. How satisfied are you with your life? Overall, to what extent do you feel things you do in life are worthwhile, et cetera, et cetera. So this was designed by an expert committee of happiness experts. Notably, they were all social scientists and economists. There were no philosophers, no theologians, no artists, right? They also were very surprised that people found things like religion important in their view of, really, people would find that important. So, against criticisms that such metrics are merely hedonic measures of positive feelings, the ONS insists that the metric is about people evaluating their own lives, right? And that the metrics can capture the variety of things, a full variety of things that people value, including deeper, even spiritual aspects of life. The deeper elements are supposedly covered by question 2. Overall, to what extent do you feel that the things you do in life are worthwhile? Now, one thing to note about this is that despite the inclusion of the word worthwhile, the question remains entirely subjective, right? It's how someone feels at the moment they take the test. And it's entirely possible that someone could score themselves very highly on that metric and have little acquaintance with or interest in, say, romantic love, art, contemplation, friendship. And I would say, on reflection, it seems relatively obvious that a metric involving 4 questions on a 10-point scale is not suited to capture profound truths about the meaningfulness of people's lives, their loves, their spirituality, their place in the cosmos, and the like. Let me give you one other example, because this one's so much fun. On the test for the U.S. military designed by Seligmann, the global assessment tool, soldiers need to respond to this computer questionnaire on a 7-point scale this time, which assigns them scores of mental fitness, emotional fitness, and spiritual fitness. And that caught my attention. Spiritual fitness. What the heck does it mean by that? The soldier's spiritual fitness. Well, the latter involves, as I mentioned, meaningfulness, which is a feeling connected to something larger than yourself. Now, if you score low on this metric, you get this box on the computer that pops up that says, this is quote 7, spiritual fitness is an area of possible difficulty for you. You may lack a sense of purpose and meaning in life. There are things to do to provide more meaning and purpose in life. Change is possible, and the relevant self-development training modules are available. Okay. I'll just skip to the very end now. I'm going to skip my Aristotelian alternative to subjective well-being as a metric for human flourishing. I'll just say that it involves it's more fundamentally social, more fundamentally agential or active, and it involves an deepening experience with these things that I call deep goods in human life that resist codification in theories. And it also involves starting from a position that I call situated reflection, which is we're already leading lives. We already have certain values and concerns. What we should do is not detach ourselves from those concerns and try and see ourselves from the outside, but try and sort of reflect from within our concerns and figure out how to understand them more fully or more deeply and see how they may expand out to a more encompassing view of the human good. So that would be reflection from inside the lived experience than from the outside. Okay, but I gotta ask this question. What explains the prestige of this stuff? It's getting a lot of funding. It's getting the attention of governments. The Buddhist monk was at Davos in 2017. What's going on here? Now I'm going to shift to, this is much more of a sociological and sort of critical kind of vein of reflection. So what I would say is the increasing prestige and prevalence in contemporary culture of administrable techniques and managerial instrumental forms of reasoning is plausibly seen as the flip side of an increasing difficulty we have with other forms of thought and inquiry, including more open-ended forms of reflection into what makes human life meaningful and worth living, and what on earth it could mean that something is valuable for itself. I feel like the very idea of intrinsic or non-instrumental value is very hard for us to understand at this point in time in history. We're thinking about happiness this is something that I think the positive psychologists don't get. We're thinking about happiness at a particular point in time in history, right? It's hard for us to make sense of what could be good in itself. An example of this is this book that I found called The Happiness Advantage, the 7 Principles of Positive Psychology that Fuel Success and Performance at Work. There, the argument is that happiness is instrumentally valuable to get you to compete better in the marketplace, right? So this shows how even happiness, right, is sort of getting turned into some sort of instrumental good. Very hard for us to make sense of what that is, right? So so we're having trouble making sense of those ends in themselves. But our confidence in administrable techniques and technology, on the other hand, is stronger than ever, seemingly to fill this void. So liberal, free market societies are very good at meeting certain ends, historically speaking. Economists tout the so-called hockey stick of prosperity since the Industrial Revolution, the enormous rise in levels of material well-being and physical safety, sanitation, etc. But as a variety of political thinkers have stressed recently, high technology, liberal democratic market capitalism may not meet all the needs of the human spirit, especially our need for coherent, meaningful, spiritually fulfilling life in a stable, supportive community. It is reassuring, and not just to elites, to think, especially in a context in which people are feeling increasingly alienated from the large-scale institutions that affect them and govern them. It is reassuring, and not just to elites, to think that the difficult aspects of the human predicament are slowly being conquered through scientific rigor and technique, just as the natural world has been. Right? If only happiness and contentment could be turned into an administrable technique. Thus, I say, this is the real interest of the Office of National Statistics in the UK, the Nudge Unit, the OECD, the UN, the US Army, the European Commission, in seemingly arcane philosophical questions about human spiritual fulfillment, right? Why on earth would these institutions be interested in these things? Unfortunately, I think, this is what I'll end with, a detached technical and administrative stance on the psychological components of happiness does not expose the real challenges to living well as human beings in conditions of advanced modernity in the 21st century, for the simple reason that processes of reflective detachment, subsuming everything into instrumental and technical reasoning, producing more and more metrics, and expanding bureaucratic administration into ever more aspects of may itself be part of the problem, right? This view is, I think, incapable of recognizing the real sources of well-being and thus the real sources of dissatisfaction. Including the sort of threat posed to the institutions and spaces in social life where we may, the non-bureaucratically administered spaces in social life where we may develop a deeper appreciation of certain goods like friendship and creativity and contemplation. Those areas of social life I feel like are getting squeezed, and as they get squeezed, we're looking for some substitute notion of happiness that can fill the void and be administered to us by experts. Okay, thank you. Sorry I went on for a while.
I'm short, so I have to adjust it. So thank you for the paper. I think we're running low on time, so I'm going to try to just get to the nuggets of this, my comment. So I enjoyed this, studying this paper. Unfortunately, I mean, it's a rich paper, the written version. So I really enjoyed it. I don't know if that's vicious to admit. As a philosopher myself, and of the particularly outdated sort, it's always nice to hear social science get bashed. But I'm just joking. I'm pleased to be here because this kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary conversation is the only way to get at the kind of unified real object of each of our inquiries. Each of us only has an aspect of it. So this is a very fruitful conference. So I want to raise a question about the criticism of the wrong sort of subjectivity. So just a reminder, Phil brings out this thing he calls psychological subjectivism, the wrong kind, where all meaning lies exclusively in a kind of first personal, introspective, subjective psychological state, this kind of reporting of this feeling, and it's wholly distinguished or abstracted or isolated from the external objects. So the question is rather ancient, I think. It's a question about self-knowledge and this kind of first personal awareness. So I study Aristotle, and one of these puzzling things Aristotle says is that when you achieve scientific knowledge or a theoretical achievement, when you genuinely possess knowledge of a thing, it can't escape your notice. You're going to have a first personal authority. You'll be able to report that you know the thing that you actually, in fact, know. And you might think that he has a similar account of happiness. He thinks that the happy life is the most pleasant, and that the truly happy person would report that. Now, that doesn't mean that our first personal reports are incorrigible, right? We can mistakenly suppose that we're happy or mistakenly suppose that we have scientific knowledge. Okay. But those who are really happy are going to be able to report it. So classical theorists, and I don't just mean philosophers, but tragedians like Sophocles, I'm pleased that I'm not the first person to bring up Sophocles today. But also historians like Thucydides are obsessed with this question of getting it right. It's not easy to know if we know, but when we really do know, we'll know it. Okay, you see how this generates this enormous problem of self-knowledge in antiquity. So that's why I think Socrates, when he brings up this problem of self-knowledge in one of the dialogues, he remarks that if he didn't know his friend Phaedrus, he wouldn't know himself. And Aristotle, too, in his treatise on friendship, says, the happy man needs friends, not just as one good among many, but as a way of structuring the happy life, so that he can see himself like in a mirror. Not so he can just live the contemplative life better in general, but so that he can contemplate himself better. Okay. So this raises a question about friendship in this account. So if a flaw in today's happiness science is its individualism, one wonders if it could be improved by interviewing a subject's friends, handing them maybe the exact same survey. Now, if replication is a problem already, then surely this is going to introduce a whole new dimension of problem for the studies, but it's an interesting question, I believe. And I also wonder about Hasselberger's himself, his own view, the way in which friendship plays a role not merely as an activity, not merely as one of these deep goods that constitutes some one part of the fulfilling life, as one meaningful activity among many, but that it's actually forming the structure within which more particular life activities, right? Not everybody needs to know how to play the piano and enjoy fulfillment in that particular way, but it seems odd to think that friendship is optional. So I'm kind of curious about that. All right, so I'll skip to the next one. So that raises questions about this distinction between deep and shallow goods, which he gestured at, but it's developed very nicely in the paper. So I have a question about this. Similarly, we're all bringing up our children because it's sort of our own little informal laboratories to study these things. The only empirical evidence I have is with my children. So I have a question then about, say, take the particular example of playing music. So that's going to be one of these deep goods. That's going to be one of these goods that's non-instrumental. Non-instrumental in the relevant sense for our discussion. So it's sort of a stock case. But I've started teaching my son, who's 7, to play the piano, and it's amazing how the dexterity of one's fingers is an amazing achievement for those that can play piano, and his fingers just don't have it. So if somebody were to tell him that what he's doing on the piano is somehow markedly different from working on an assembly line, he might react with skepticism. Okay, so this raises a deep question about self-knowledge, about this sort of how do we know that what we're doing is a part of a kind of temporally extended, deep human activity, right? How do we know when we're in that lived, concrete, embedded experience? How do we know? And I think here, not only do our friends help, but our betters. So appealing to a tradition, appealing to an authority, appealing to your coach, your piano teacher, as a way of helping you identify, your parents, right, as a way of helping identify which are the hopeless, meaningless activities, life activities, like the assembly line thing, and which are the ones that, although feel like a slog now, could bear fruit in something that is deep. So I want to suggest, let me see here, I want to say this. So to be sure, part of his thesis, I take it, is that no generic account is possible. The second order distinction between deep goods and shallow goods, there's not going to be any context neutral method that we'll be able to do. I think that otherwise we fall into the managerial trap by another route. So I take it that that's part of his view, but I want to suggest a key part of the answer here is that, yeah, tragedies do happen. That studying Sophocles should be a core part of a happiness studies major in 50 years, whenever, God help us, that happens, right? Philosopher Arie Cosman, who's an ancient philosopher, he, in kind of a technical paper, remarks that personal tragedies result when, in his own language, people mistake meaningful activities for meaningless ones, non-instrumental activities for instrumental ones, to use the idiom that we have here. And that's not an easy mistake to avoid. We can't simply eyeball the activities of our life from our embedded lived experience and say, this is the deep one, this is the shallow one. Now, I don't mean to say that he's committed to that thesis, but it might be a particularly tempting way to misunderstand him, it seems to me. In part of the paper that he didn't read, he says, either you recognize deep goods or you don't. And I think one kind of crucial way to misunderstand him on that would be to think that there's like this phenomenological eyeballing of our life activities where we can see the... But I think a more generous interpretation regards the possibility of tragedy, a life that pursues the wrong sorts of activities without noticing until it's too late, maybe. This is a feature of a classically oriented account of happiness and not a bug. I want to make one final mark to accentuate this particular difficulty in view of the remarks he made at the end of his paper about the kind of appeal of this technocratic, more quantitative approach. We're entering this brave new world, and part of the effect of a lot of these technologies is that it's frustrating human fulfillment in a number of ways. Now, perhaps social science done right could help us identify these new constraints and difficulties for human flourishing, not in the subjective, introspective side, but on the objective side of the ways in which we're objectively frustrated in our pursuit of these meaningful goods. For example, the way that a lot of social science now is showing that pornography is causing all kinds of problems with people's relationships, and ability to form kind of healthy sexual identities and marriages. This would require the practice and results of social scientific research to be open to conversation with the kind of philosophical account given in today's paper. And to that end, his paper is a fine contribution to a wider cultural project. So thank you for the paper.